Houston, we have a crew communication breakdown. Crew morale is deteriorating. Personal conflicts are escalating. Mission performance is at risk. Requesting psychological support protocol. That transmission? It's real. NASA has a documented protocol for exactly this scenario, because it happens regularly. On the most carefully selected, most thoroughly screened, most psychologically tested crews on the planet. Here is what nobody tells you about astronaut selection. NASA doesn't just pick the smartest people or the most physically fit. They pick people who score in the top percentile on every psychological metric available: team compatibility, emotional regulation, conflict resolution, interpersonal intelligence, and then they lock 6 of those perfect psychological specimens in a metal tube the size of a 6-bedroom house for 6 months. No privacy, no fresh air, no walking away, no going home when it gets hard. And here is the uncomfortable truth that decades of space psychology research keeps arriving at. The #1 mission risk in long-duration spaceflight is not equipment failure, it is not radiation, it is not the void of space, it is the people you are locked in with. Now, I want you to think about your own life for exactly one moment. Your family, your coworkers, your partner, the people in your apartment building, your neighborhood, your social circle, relationships you did not fully choose, cannot easily exit, and have to navigate every single day. You already live in a spacecraft. You just haven't been thinking about it that way. And today, we're going to fix that. Welcome back. If this is your first time here, I'm glad the algorithm brought you to this video, because what we're about to cover is something that most relationship psychology content completely ignores. We're not talking about how to find better relationships. We're not talking about setting boundaries or communicating your needs or any of the standard self-help frameworks you've already heard. We're talking about the relationships you are already in, the ones you didn't fully choose, the ones that are hard, the ones that exhaust you, confuse you, sometimes make you feel genuinely trapped. And we're going to use the most extreme version of this problem that human beings have ever engineered, long-duration space missions, to understand what is actually happening in those relationships and what the science says about navigating them. Here's the central premise of today's video, and I want you to hold this premise all the way through because it's going to reframe everything. Same attachment patterns, same conflict escalation cycles, same in-group and out-group formation, same resentment accumulation, same breakdown mechanisms, same recovery pathways. NASA has been studying these dynamics with scientific precision for over 50 years, and they have learned things that almost nobody outside of crew psychology research has heard, things that would completely change how you understand the difficult relationships in your own life. Here is what we're covering today. First, why you're stuck, the actual psychological mechanism behind feeling trapped in relationships you didn't choose. Second, the 4 crew archetypes that appear in every confined group and which one is quietly destroying your mission. Third, the unexpected twist that changes everything, what NASA discovered about where conflict actually comes from. Fourth, the navigation system, what space psychology teaches us about managing impossible relationships. And fifth, the question I want you to carry out of this video. Before we go any further, drop a comment right now. Tell me, which relationship in your life do you feel most stuck in? You don't have to name names, just the type: family member, coworker, partner, neighbor. I will read them in the first 24 hours, and I want to know what brought you here today. Let's start with the mechanism. Why does being in a relationship you cannot easily exit feel fundamentally different from a relationship you chose freely? Space psychologists call the core variable the closed environment effect. Here is how it works. In a normal social environment, you have what psychologists call exit optionality. If a relationship becomes difficult, you can create distance, you can leave the room, you can stop calling, you can in most cases simply not be there. Exit optionality is a psychological safety valve. Even if you never use it, Knowing it exists fundamentally changes how you experience the relationship. You feel less reactive, less threatened, less compelled to resolve everything immediately because you always have the option to step away. Now remove that option. On the International Space Station, there is nowhere to go. If you have a conflict with a crewmate, you will be in the same module with them tomorrow and the day after. For the next 4 months, you will share the same air, the same food, the same sleeping quarters, the same work schedule. The conflict does not resolve by time or distance. It sits, it accumulates, it compounds. And here is what the research shows. When exit optionality is removed, the psychological stakes of every interaction rise dramatically. Minor irritations that you would shrug off in a normal social environment become significant threats. A crewmate who chews loudly, who doesn't replace supplies, who communicates in a style that grates on you, in a normal context, mildly annoying. In a closed environment, potentially mission critical. This is not weakness or irrationality. This is your nervous system accurately reading the situation. In a closed environment, social friction is more dangerous. Your threat detection system knows this. It escalates accordingly. Which is why the most important insight from closed environment psychology is this. If you feel disproportionately affected by people in your life that you should theoretically be able to brush off, you are not overreacting. You are living in a closed environment, and your nervous system is doing exactly what it was designed to do. Your family home is a closed environment. Your workplace, especially remote work, where home and office have collapsed into the same space, is a closed environment. Your marriage, your long-term partnership, any relationship where the social and logistical costs of exit are high, all closed environments. All subject to the same psychological amplification effect that NASA studies in orbit. Now, here's where it gets very specific. And I want you to think about the people in your own closed environment while I go through these. Decades of crew psychology research, from NASA, ESA, the Russian space program, and parallel studies in Antarctic research stations, have consistently identified 4 relational archetypes that appear in virtually every confined group. These are not personality types. They are behavioral roles that people occupy under the pressure of a closed environment, and understanding them is the first step to navigating them. Archetype 1, the mission driver. This is the person whose entire identity is organized around task completion. In a space crew, this is the crew member who is always working, always optimizing, always pushing for higher performance. They are invaluable for mission outcomes and genuinely difficult to be around. Because the mission driver relates to other people primarily as resources, as more or less capable instruments for achieving goals. When things go well, the mission driver is celebrated. When things get hard, the mission driver becomes domineering, dismissive of emotional needs, and confused, sometimes genuinely unable to understand why the rest of the crew is not performing at maximum capacity at all times. In your life, this person shows up as the parent who measures love through achievement, the boss who cannot understand why personal problems affect work performance, the partner who approaches the relationship like a project to optimize. Archetype 2, the harmonizer. The harmonizer is the social architect of the crew. They read emotional atmospheres with extraordinary sensitivity. They smooth tension before it becomes conflict. They are the person who notices when 2 crew members haven't spoken in 3 days and quietly engineers a situation to bring them back together. The harmonizer's shadow is severe because the cost of being the person who absorbs everyone else's tension, who is always adjusting, always mediating, always prioritizing group cohesion over personal truth, is a gradual, invisible erasure of self. Harmonizers in space crew research are disproportionately likely to experience psychological deterioration in the 3rd quarter of missions, precisely because they have been running at full social-emotional capacity since day 1 and have never once asked, "What do I need?" In your life, this is the family member who keeps every holiday from exploding, the friend who everyone calls but no one checks in on, the person in any group who holds everything together while quietly coming apart. Archetype 3, the isolator. Here is the one that surprises people. The isolator is not antisocial. They are not unfriendly. They are the crew member who has simply decided at some point during the mission that withdrawal is safer than engagement. They complete their tasks. They show up for required interactions, but they have emotionally exited the crew. NASA research identifies isolator behavior as one of the earliest and most reliable warning signs of crew psychological deterioration. Not because the isolator is causing conflict, they are not, but because a crew member who is disengaged is providing no psychological support to the group. In a closed environment where every person's well-being is partially dependent on the collective, someone who stops contributing to the emotional ecosystem creates a vacuum. More importantly, isolators rarely identify themselves as being in distress. They describe their withdrawal as a preference, a personality trait, a deliberate choice. It takes a skilled psychological observer to recognize that what looks like introversion is actually protection. In your life, this is the family member who stopped coming to gatherings, the colleague who has their camera off in every meeting, the partner who has stopped initiating any real conversation, present in body, absent in every way that matters. I want to tell you about one of the most important findings in the entire field of space crew psychology, because it fundamentally changes the frame through which we understand conflict in closed environments. For decades, the assumption was that crew conflict was primarily a selection problem. If you picked the right people, psychologically compatible, emotionally stable, complementary personality profiles, you would get functional crews. The research and development effort went into building better personality tests, better compatibility models, better selection algorithms. And then a 2010 meta-analysis examining data from over 300 long-duration missions, Antarctic expeditions, and submarine deployments found something that shook the field. Crew compatibility at the point of selection was a weak predictor of crew conflict at the point of crisis. The strongest predictor of conflict was not who the people were, it was what the environment did to them over time. Specifically, 3 environmental factors were identified as the primary drivers of crew breakdown, regardless of the personalities involved. Factor 1, ambiguity of roles and expectations. When people are unclear about who is responsible for what, and when those boundaries shift under pressure, conflict emerges, not from personality clashes but from structural gaps. Factor 2, perceived inequity in workload and recognition. When crew members feel that contributions are not fairly distributed or fairly acknowledged, resentment accumulates. This happens even in crews where everyone likes each other. Fairness is not a preference, it is a deep neurobiological need. Perceived inequity activates the same threat response pathways as physical danger. Factor 3, communication breakdown at the information interface. When crew members operate on different assumptions about the state of the mission, when they do not share the same information about problems, plans, and changes, they begin to attribute the resulting friction to personal failings rather than systemic gaps. Here is why this matters enormously for your life. Most of the conflict in your closest relationships is not primarily about the people involved, it is about the system you are operating in. The argument with your partner that keeps recurring, about household responsibilities, about how decisions are made, about who does the invisible work. That argument is almost certainly being driven by role ambiguity and perceived inequity, not by fundamental incompatibility. The tension with your coworker that feels personal, the friction, the miscommunications, the sense that they are working against you, that is most likely being amplified by a structural communication gap, not by their personality. The family conflict that has lasted for years, the one that everyone has taken sides on, the one that feels like it is about deep personal failings, I want to suggest to you that it has at its root a systemic structure, a role that was never clearly defined, a contribution that was never recognized, a communication that was never completed. This reframe is not about removing accountability. People are still responsible for their behavior. But it is about expanding the level of analysis, because if you treat a systems problem as a personality problem, you will spend years trying to fix something that cannot be fixed at the level you're targeting. So, what do you actually do with this? NASA doesn't just study what goes wrong in crew relationships. They have developed over decades of iteration a set of behavioral interventions that work, that actually measurably reduce conflict, improve crew cohesion, and increase mission performance in closed environments. And virtually all of them are directly applicable to the closed environments in your life. Navigation tool. 1. The Mission Clarification Protocol. Every NASA crew, before mission launch, goes through an extended process of explicitly defining not just technical roles, but relational expectations. Who makes decisions in which domains? What happens when there is disagreement? What are the non-negotiables for each crew member, the boundaries that, if violated, will cause the most significant psychological distress? This sounds formal. It is formal. That is precisely why it works. Because in the absence of explicit agreements, people default to assumptions. And assumptions in closed environments are the precursor to almost every major conflict. In your life, this means having the conversation you have been avoiding. Not the conflict conversation, the clarification conversation. What do we each actually expect here? What does fairness look like in this relationship? What is the one thing that, if it keeps happening, will cause me to emotionally exit? Most relationships never have this conversation. They accumulate years of unmet assumptions instead. Navigation tool. 2. The structured debrief. NASA crews conduct regular psychological debriefs, not as a response to crisis, but as a preventive protocol. The debrief is a structured conversation in which each crew member has explicit, protected time to report on their psychological state, name any tensions they are carrying, and receive acknowledgement from the group. The critical feature is the structure. This is not an open-ended conversation about feelings. It is a bounded, time-limited, role-separated process. And the research shows that the formality is not a limitation, it is the mechanism. It creates safety for disclosure by removing the social ambiguity that makes honesty feel dangerous. In your life, this could look like a weekly 15-minute check-in with a partner or family member that is explicitly about naming what is hard, not solving it, just naming it. The act of naming a tension in a context where you have been heard is itself a conflict prevention mechanism. Resentment cannot accumulate in a relationship where honesty is regularly practiced. Navigation tool. 3. Functional distance. Here is one of the most counterintuitive findings from closed environment research. The crews that maintain the best long-term psychological health are not the crews that are the most tightly connected. They are the crews that have developed what psychologists call functional distance, the ability to be genuinely present and engaged in the relationship while simultaneously maintaining a sense of individual psychological identity. Functional distance is not emotional withdrawal. It is not coldness or disengagement. It is the ability to be affected by others without being consumed by them. To care about someone's well-being without making their emotional state the primary determinant of your own. In practical terms, it means having something that is fully yours within a closed environment. A practice, a space, a pursuit that is not shared and not negotiable. On the ISS, crew members who report the highest well-being are consistently the ones who have found a corner of the station, a routine, a creative practice that belongs to them alone. In your life, this is not selfish. It is structurally necessary. You cannot sustain genuine presence in a relationship if you have no self outside of it. The astronaut who gives everything to the crew and keeps nothing for themselves is, according to the data, the astronaut most at risk of breakdown. I want to step out of the framework for a moment and talk to you directly, because I think some of you came into this video with a specific person in mind, someone in your life who you feel genuinely stuck with, a family member you love and cannot reach, a coworker who makes your work environment unbearable, a partner with whom the distance has become so familiar that you can barely remember what connection felt like. And I want to offer you something that the research keeps arriving at, that I think most relationship content is afraid to say directly. The fact that a relationship is hard does not mean it is wrong, and the fact that a relationship is easy does not mean it is healthy. The most psychologically important relationships in your life will often be the ones with the highest friction. Not because difficulty is virtuous, it is not, But because relationships in closed environments are the primary arena in which your deepest psychological patterns become visible, the things you cannot see about yourself in solitude and freedom in the easy relationships, they emerge with extraordinary clarity when you are stuck. An astronaut 6 months into a mission does not have the luxury of avoiding the thing they discovered about themselves in month 2. They live with it. They see it in the mirror every morning. They see it reflected back in the faces of their crewmates. And this is, for many of them, the most psychologically transformative experience of their lives. Not the view from the porthole, not the spacewalk, the confrontation in a closed environment with no exit with who they actually are. Here is the question I want you to sit with. What is the relationship you are most stuck in teaching you that no easier relationship could? Not what is it costing you, not what you wish were different. What is it teaching you? Because here is what space psychology has found consistently across decades of research into the most isolated and high-pressure relational environments human beings have ever designed. The crews that come back transformed, not just intact, but genuinely changed, with a depth of self-understanding and relational capacity that they did not have before launch, are not the crews that avoided conflict. They are the crews that stopped trying to escape it and started trying to understand it. They learned to ask, what is this situation showing me? What is this person reflecting back? What does my reaction to this closed environment reveal about the closed environments I grew up in? Because your first closed environment, the one that calibrated all your relational defaults, that set every dial in your cockpit for every relationship you would ever have, was not a spacecraft. It was the family you didn't choose. The dynamics playing out in your most difficult current relationships are, in most cases, the dynamics that were first installed in that original closed environment. The attachment patterns, the conflict responses, the need for approval or the fear of intimacy or the compulsion to manage other people's emotions, all of it was written in the first mission, long before you were old enough to understand what was happening, and understanding this, really understanding it, not just intellectually but in a way that lands in the body, is what the research calls differentiation. The ability to see the pattern clearly enough that you are no longer entirely inside it. The ability to be in the relationship without being only the relationship. That is the overview effect for your inner life. You get enough altitude to see the shape of the whole thing, and the shape from up there turns out to be more coherent, more understandable, more even forgivable than it looked from inside. Which means the mission is not to find better people. It is not to escape the closed environment. It is to become the kind of crew member who can navigate any environment because you understand your own cockpit well enough to fly it deliberately rather than just running the defaults that were programmed when you were too young to have a choice. Mission debrief. Let's lock in what we covered. 1. The closed environment effect. When exit optionality is removed from a relationship, the psychological stakes of every interaction rise. This is not weakness or irrationality. It is your nervous system accurately reading the situation. You are already living in a closed environment. The same psychological mechanisms NASA studies in orbit are operating in your family, your workplace, your long-term relationships. 2. The 4 crew archetypes. The mission driver, the harmonizer, the isolator, and the friction generator all appear in every confined group. The one you are most frustrated by is not necessarily the one creating the most damage, and the one you most easily overlook, including yourself in one of these roles, may be the most important person to understand. 3. The unexpected twist. Most conflict in closed environments is not primarily about personality incompatibility. It is about system failures, role ambiguity, perceived inequity, and communication gaps. If you keep having the same conflict and trying to fix it at the personality level, you are solving for the wrong variable. 4. The navigation system. Mission. Clarification, structured debrief, and functional distance are not abstract concepts. They are practical behavioral protocols that measurably reduce conflict and increase well-being in closed environments. All 3 are available to you, starting today. 5. The real mission. The most difficult relationship in your life may be your most important teacher. Not because difficulty is virtuous, but because closed environments with no easy exit are the places where your deepest patterns become visible. And visibility is the first step to choice. Here is your mission before the next video. Take one relationship in your life that you feel stuck in, and instead of asking, "How do I get out of this?" or "How do I change this person?" ask, "What is the system creating this friction? Is there a role that was never clarified? A contribution that was never recognized? A communication that was never completed?" You don't have to solve it this week. Just ask the question. Sometimes asking the right question about a closed environment is the first time you have ever been outside it. Now I want to hear from you. Earlier, I asked you to drop a comment about which relationship you feel most stuck in. I will be reading those in the first 24 hours, and I want to respond to as many as I can, because that is a real question that deserves a real answer. If this video gave you something, if one of those frameworks landed, if a reframe shifted something, hit the like button. It is a small thing from you, but it is how this content reaches the people who need it. And if you want to go deeper, the next video in this series covers what happens after the mission ends, the psychology of loss, reinvention, and what it means to rebuild your sense of self when the closed environment you organized your life around no longer exists. If you want that video, subscribe and let me know in the comments. One last thing. The crew you didn't choose, the family, the colleagues, the relationships you are stuck inside, they are not an obstacle to your psychological growth. In most cases, they are your psychological growth. The question is whether you are willing to stop waiting for a better crew and start becoming a better astronaut. I'll see you on the next mission.